November 14th, 1952. 11:47 p.m. Willie the Rock Thompson stood in the alley behind Small's Paradise on 135th Street, a .38 special pressed against the base of his skull. Four of Dutch Schultz's remaining enforcers surrounded him. Jake, the Hammer Malloy, two Sicilian brothers named Carmine and Sal Vitale, and a trigger-happy kid from Brooklyn everyone called Twitch. They had him dead to rights. The smart money said Willie would be face down in the Hudson by sunrise. But what Dutch Schultz's men didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Willie Thompson had made a promise to Bumpy Johnson 6 years earlier. A promise that would turn this execution into a masterclass in loyalty and change the balance of power in Harlem forever. This is the story of how one man's split-second decision wrote the unwritten rules of street justice that still echo through Harlem today. To understand what happened in that alley, you need to understand who Willie Thompson was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. Willie wasn't a killer. He was a driver. A mechanic from South Carolina who'd come to Harlem in 1946 with $47 in his pocket and grease under his fingernails. He'd never even held a gun until Bumpy Johnson hired him in the summer of '46 to maintain the fleet of Cadillacs that moved policy numbers across uptown Manhattan. But in September of that same year, when two Irish mobsters tried to ambush Bumpy outside the Savoy Ballroom, Willie had thrown his boss behind his own body and taken a bullet through his left shoulder. Didn't fire back, didn't run, just stood there bleeding while Bumpy's real shooters arrived and ended the threat. Bumpy visited him every day during his 3-week hospital stay. On the last day, Bumpy had sat at the edge of Willie's bed and said something Willie never forgot. Most men, they protect themselves and call it loyalty. You protected me and didn't think twice. That's rare, Willie. That's real. You ever need anything, you come find me. Willie was 28 years old then. He didn't know that promise would be called in 6 years later. By November 1952, the streets of Harlem were still echoing with the aftermath of Dutch Schultz's murder 17 years earlier, in 1935. But Schultz's organization hadn't died with him. It had splintered, franchised, mutated into smaller crews run by vindictive men with long memories and short tempers. Jake Malloy was one of those men. He'd lost a brother in the war between Schultz and Bumpy back in '35, lost $15,000 in a policy war in '48. And he'd been waiting, patient, calculating, for the right moment to strike at Bumpy's operation. But Bumpy Johnson didn't leave openings. His inner circle was airtight. His soldiers were loyal. His movements were unpredictable. So Malloy went after the mechanic. November 13th, 1952, 3:15 p.m. Willie was under a burgundy Packard in Bumpy's garage on Lenox Avenue when he heard the footsteps. 2 sets. Expensive shoes on concrete. He slid out from beneath the chassis to find Carmine and Sal Vitale standing over him. Both wore gray overcoats. Both had their hands in their pockets. Jake Malloy wants to talk, Carmine said. His accent was thick Sicilian. Tomorrow night. Small's Paradise. Back alley. 11:30. I don't know no Jake Malloy, Willie said, getting to his feet slowly. You will. Sal smiled without warmth. He knows you. Knows you drive for Bumpy. Knows Bumpy trusts you. So here's how this works. You show up tomorrow night, alone, and you deliver a message to Bumpy for us. You do that. We pay you $2,000 and you never see us again. And if I don't show? Carmine pulled his hand from his pocket. Not a gun, a photograph. Willie's sister, Denise, walking out of the post office on 125th Street with her 6-year-old daughter. Willie's jaw tightened. You'll show, Sal said. They left without another word. Most men would have run straight to Bumpy. Would have asked for protection, for soldiers, for a countermove. But Willie Thompson wasn't most men. He knew what this was. They weren't trying to flip him. They were trying to isolate him. If he went to Bumpy, they'd know Willie was loyal, and they'd hurt Denise anyway out of spite. If he showed up at Small's Paradise, they'd kill him and use his death to send a message. Nobody who works for Bumpy is safe. Either way, Willie was the message. So Willie did something neither side expected. He didn't run to Bumpy. He didn't hide. He didn't arm himself. He went to see a man named Solomon Preacher Davis. Solomon Davis wasn't a gangster. He was a deacon at Abyssinian Baptist Church and a former medic who'd served in the First World War. He'd also spent 3 years in Sing Sing for manslaughter in 1931, a bar fight gone wrong. And during that time, He'd learned things about men and violence that churches don't teach. Willie found him that same evening at a basement poker game on 138th Street. "Preacher," Willie said, pulling him aside. "I need to know something." "I'm listening." "If a man's got a gun to your head, and you got no weapon, and there's four of them and one of you, what do you do?" Solomon studied Willie's face for a long moment. "You asking hypothetically, or you asking 'cause you got less than 24 hours?" Willie didn't answer. Didn't need to. Solomon nodded slowly. "Then you need to understand something about men with guns, Willie. A man who puts a gun to another man's head is making a bet. He's betting you're more afraid of dying than he is of killing. The second you show him he's wrong, the second he doubts his own bet, that's when you're alive. How do I show him he's wrong?" "You do the one thing he ain't prepared for." "What's that?" Solomon leaned in close. "You make him believe you want him to pull the trigger." November 14th, 1952. 11:18 p.m. Willie arrived at Small's Paradise 12 minutes early. The club was alive with Friday night energy. Billie Holiday's voice floating from the speakers inside, laughter and cigarette smoke spilling into the cold November air. But Willie walked past the front entrance and headed for the alley. It was dark. A single street lamp flickered at the mouth of the alley, casting long shadows against the brick. The smell of rotting garbage and motor oil hung thick in the air. Willie wore the same thing he always wore, a dark blue work jacket, gray trousers, steel-toed boots. No weapon, no backup plan. He stood under the flickering light and waited. At 11:32 p.m., they arrived. Jake Malloy came first, a thick-necked Irishman in his late 40s with a crooked nose and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a black wool coat and a fedora tilted low. Behind him came Carmine and Sal Vitale, flanking him like bookends. And trailing behind, nervous and twitchy, was the kid from Brooklyn, one hand already inside his jacket. "Willie Thompson," Jake said, his voice like gravel. "You got balls showing up. You asked me to come." "I did." Jake stepped closer. "Here's how this works. You're gonna walk into Bumpy's spot tomorrow afternoon and tell him Jake Malloy runs 135th Street now. Tell him the policy game is ours. Tell him if he's got a problem with that, we'll settle it the old-fashioned way." "Bumpy don't take orders," Willie said calmly. "Then we'll start with you." Jake nodded to Carmine. Carmine stepped forward, pulled a .38 special from his coat, and pressed the barrel against the back of Willie's skull. The alley went silent except for the distant hum of music from inside the club. "Last chance," Jake said. "Deliver the message, or we deliver you." Willie didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't turn around. He simply said, "Go ahead." Jake blinked. "What?" "I said go ahead." Willie's voice was steady, eerily calm. "You think I came here not knowing what this was? You think I'm stupid?" Carmine pressed the gun harder against Willie's skull. "You got a death wish mechanic?" Willie finally turned his head, slowly, and looked Jake Malloy directly in the eyes. "You ever wonder why Bumpy keeps a guy like me close? I'm no shooter. I'm no strategist. I'm just a mechanic." "So what?" Jake didn't answer. "Because 6 years ago, I took a bullet for him without thinking twice. You know what that makes me to Bumpy? Family. And you know what happens when you kill family?" That's when Jake Malloy understood. If they pulled that trigger, they weren't just killing Willie Thompson. They were declaring war on Bumpy Johnson. Not the calculated kind. Not the strategic kind. The personal kind. The kind where Bumpy wouldn't stop until everyone in that alley, and everyone they loved, was gone. And Willie knew that. He'd counted on it. "So here's what's really happening," Willie continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Either you pull that trigger and spend the rest of your short life looking over your shoulder, or you let me walk, and we all forget this happened." The room, the alley, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Jake's eyes flickered to Carmine, to Sal, to Twitch. "You're bluffing," Jake said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Then call it." 10 seconds passed. 15. 20. Jake Malloy's jaw tightened. "Let him go, boss." "I said let him go." Carmine lowered the gun. Willie turned and walked toward the mouth of the alley. Slow, measured, every step calculated. He didn't run, didn't look back. When he reached the street lamp, he stopped, turned, and said one last thing. "Tell Dutch Schultz I said hello." Then he disappeared into the Harlem night. By sunrise on November 15th, every number runner, every policy banker, every street soldier in Harlem knew what Willie Thompson had done. He'd walked into an execution and walked out alive. Not because he was fast, Not because he was armed, but because he understood something most men spend their whole lives missing. Real power isn't in the trigger. It's in making the man holding the gun afraid to pull it. Jake Malloy left New York 3 days later. Carmine and Sal Vitale went back to working small-time shakedowns in Little Italy. Twitch the Kid? Nobody ever saw him again. And Willie Thompson? Bumpy promoted him from mechanic to head of security that same week. Paid him $150 a week, more than most doctors made in Harlem. Willie held that position until Bumpy died in 1968. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It wasn't even the title. It was the story. For the next 16 years, whenever someone new came to Harlem thinking they could muscle in on Bumpy's operation, someone would tell them about Willie Thompson. About the night he stood in an alley with a gun to his head and dared a man to pull the trigger. And they'd always end the story the same way. If that's the mechanic, imagine what the boss is like. Willie Thompson was 34 years old the night he walked into that alley. He lived to be 81. Died peacefully in his sleep in 1999, surrounded by family. He never fired a gun in his life. Most men would have seen that as a weakness. But Willie Thompson wasn't most men. He understood what Jake Malloy learned too late, what every street legend eventually learns. Real power isn't about how many bullets you've got. It's about making sure nobody wants to fire the first one. If you believe loyalty is worth more than fear, hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have walked into that alley? And subscribe, because next week, I'm breaking down the night Frank Lucas double-crossed the Italian mafia and lived to tell about it. Remember, the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one who doesn't need it.